These 5 Buddhist teachings tonight are not about becoming someone better. They are about coming back to who you already are. Feel the full weight of your body right now. The pressure of whatever is holding you up. That is where you are. Not last week, not tomorrow morning. Here. 25 centuries ago, a being of extraordinary power spent an entire lifetime traveling at impossible speed, searching for the end of the world. He never found it. When he finally asked the Buddha where it was, the answer stopped him completely. Everything you are looking for lives inside this body, in this moment of awareness. He had crossed the entire universe when the only place he ever needed to be was exactly where he stood. You will understand something tonight that most explanations talk around but never quite land. Why searching harder has never been the answer. Why coming back is not the same as giving up. Why the peace you have been trying to build from the outside has always been available from somewhere much closer. Not as theory. As something you will feel before this opening is finished. Get comfortable and let your body sink fully into wherever you are. Right now, people are settling into this same silence from every corner of the world. Imagine receiving an answer that does not give you new information. An answer that instead shows you that the question itself was pointed in the wrong direction entirely. Not a correction, not a consolation. A reorientation so complete that everything you spent trying to find the answer feels not wasted, but simply, quietly finished. This is what happened when the Buddha told a being named Rohitassa that everything he had spent a cosmic lifetime searching for was contained within the length of his own arms. Within this fathom-long body, endowed with perception and mind, lies the world, its arising, its cessation, and the path leading to its cessation. A fathom is roughly the distance from one outstretched fingertip to the other when you open your arms completely wide. The world Rohitassa had been traveling toward, and the end of all his searching, was the length of his own body. It had been the length of his own body the entire time. The words themselves are not complicated. But there is a kind of understanding that arrives not in the mind, but somewhere lower and more physical, a settling, a recognition that moves through the chest before any explanation of it is possible, that comes when you hear something that is not new information but is, somehow, the first time something always technically known has actually landed. Rohitassa had a body throughout every moment of his traveling. He had breath, weight, the physical fact of existing somewhere specific at each specific moment. The answer was never further along the road. It was present in every moment he was too busy moving to notice. Here, immediate, requiring no additional distance to be covered before it became available. This is the first teaching tonight, and it is not asking you to understand something new. It is asking you to notice something that is already true in the body you are currently inhabiting, right now, in whatever state it is in, after the day it has just carried you through. Your body is already here. It has been here the entire time the mind has been elsewhere. While the mind was reviewing what happened this morning, rehearsing what might happen tomorrow, maintaining its quiet background inventory of everything unresolved. The body was present. Quietly, without announcement, without asking for your attention in order to continue doing what it does. The breath was arriving. The heart was working. The weight of every part of you was resting exactly where it is resting right now. The mind travels. The body cannot. This is not a limitation. It is the most useful fact available to anyone trying to understand what the Buddha meant when he pointed Rohitasa back to the length of his own arms. Consider what mental traveling actually costs across a single ordinary day. You wake and the mind is already somewhere else, calculating what the day requires, rehearsing the first difficult moment on the schedule, carrying forward the unresolved thread from yesterday before the eyes have fully opened. You eat breakfast and the mind is at the office. You drive somewhere familiar and arrive with no memory of the journey because the mind was conducting a conversation that has not happened yet. You sit with someone you love and the mind is 3 conversations behind, still adjusting what was said in a meeting 2 days ago. You lie down to rest and the mind accelerates, as though stillness of the body were an invitation for the mind to move faster, filling the quieted space with everything it has been saving for when you finally had time to worry about it properly. None of the places the mind traveled to were real in the way this moment is real. The meeting being rehearsed had not yet occurred and might not occur the way it was being imagined. The conversation being adjusted was over and could not be changed. And yet the energy spent in those mental travels was entirely real, drawn from the same reserves that belong to the actual living of an actual life. This is the cost the Buddha was pointing at, not the traveling itself, but the life that passes through you while you are busy being somewhere else. Feel, for a moment, the specific weight of your hands. Wherever they are resting right now, on your chest, at your sides, folded across your body, they have a particular heaviness that is entirely distinct from the idea of hands. Not hands in general, not the memory of your hands from earlier today, not the anticipation of what they will do tomorrow. These specific hands, in this specific position, with this specific weight, right now. This is not a relaxation technique designed to produce a particular feeling. It is the most direct route available to the place where presence actually lives. The body does not know yesterday. It does not rehearse next week. It exists with quiet and complete precision only here. The Buddha addressed this directly in the Satipatthana Sutta, one of the most detailed and carefully organized teachings on present moment awareness in the entire Pali Canon. He did not present presence as a permanent state achievable by the sufficiently dedicated. He described something more practical and more honest than that, a quality of knowing when the mind has wandered and returning from that wandering without punishment, without drama, without the additional weight of deciding the wandering itself means something has gone wrong. The Pali word at the center of this teaching is sati. It is most often translated into English as mindfulness, which is not a wrong translation, but it leaves something out that changes how the practice feels when you try to live it. At the root of sati is something simpler, remembering. Not remembering in the sense of recalling the past, but remembering in the sense of coming back. Noticing again that you are here, in this body, in this breath, in this moment that was present all along, waiting without impatience, for the attention to return to it. This makes sati a practice of returning rather than a practice of maintaining. The distinction matters more than it initially appears. If presence were a state to maintain, every moment of distraction would be a failure. Every thought about tomorrow, every mental replay of this afternoon, every ordinary drift of attention would register as evidence that something is wrong, that the practice is not working, or that you are not doing it correctly, or that your mind is more disordered than other people's minds. The practice would become one more arena for the inner critic to operate in, one more standard against which to measure inadequacy. This is the opposite of what the Buddha was pointing at. If sati is a practice of returning, the wandering is not the problem. It is simply the condition that makes the returning possible and meaningful. A mind that never wandered would have nothing to return from. The wandering and the returning are the two movements of a single practice, each requiring the other, neither one representing success or failure on its own. The instruction in the Satipatthana Sutta is clean and specific. When the mind has gone somewhere, notice it has gone and return. That is the complete description of the practice in its most essential form, not the elimination of mental movement, not the achievement of a blank, thoughtless stillness. The noticing and then the returning, available right now, requiring no special conditions, no prior achievement, no particular level of readiness before it becomes accessible. Each returning is complete in itself. This is worth staying with because it runs against almost everything the mind has been trained to believe about progress. The returning is not a step toward a future state of superior presence. Each moment of noticing, however brief, however quickly followed by another wandering, is already the practice, entire and whole. The returning available to you right now is not a lesser version of the returning available to someone who has been practicing for 30 years. It is the same returning, the same coming back, the same recognition of presence, which does not improve with repetition so much as become more familiar, more quickly available, more easily found, requiring slightly less effort each time it is practiced. Think of it this way. A person learning to play an instrument does not become more musical with each practice session in the sense that the music itself improves in kind. The first correct note struck is already music, no different in its nature from the note struck by a master. What changes with practice is access and ease, the speed with which the right movement becomes available, the naturalness with which it arrives, the decreasing gap between the intention and the execution. Sati works the same way. The returning available tonight is not inferior practice. It is the full practice, in the form currently accessible, which is the only form that has ever mattered. You are not preparing to practice. You are practicing right now in exactly the way practice has always been done, one returning at a time, each one complete, each one sufficient. Now let the body become specific. Notice the surface that is supporting you right now. The precise quality of pressure against your back or your legs or wherever your body is resting, not the concept of support, but the actual physical sensation of weight meeting resistance, the specific texture of contact between your body and whatever is holding it tonight. This sensation exists only now. It will not be exactly this tomorrow. Tomorrow, your body will arrive at rest in a slightly different configuration, carrying a different quality of tiredness, meeting that surface with a weight that belongs to a different day. This specific sensation, this one, right now, exists in this moment and will not repeat exactly. This is not a cause for sadness. It is an invitation to be here for it. The breath is the most immediate and always available anchor the Buddha described in the Satipatthana Sutta. He was specific about why. The breath is always present, always now, never requiring preparation or special conditions to be accessible. It does not need to be summoned or created. It is already happening continuously, whether or not you are paying any attention to it at all. Notice the breath arriving right now. Not breathing in general, not the concept of breath, but this specific inhale, the sensation of air entering, cooler than the air already inside, the slight expansion somewhere in the chest or belly, the brief pause at the top before the direction reverses, and then the exhale, the body releasing what it has finished with, the slight settling as the air leaves. You did not make any of this happen. It was occurring before you noticed it, and will continue after your attention has moved elsewhere. But in the moment of noticing it, not the thought about breathing but the actual physical event, something shifts slightly in the quality of the moment. In the Anapanasati Sutta, the Buddha described the breath as a complete path in itself, not merely an anchor for restless attention, but a direct way of understanding the nature of the mind and the body together. He described 16 specific aspects of breathing that become available to someone who attends to the breath with genuine care. Not 16 techniques to master in sequence, but 16 qualities of experience that gradually reveal themselves when the attention stays long enough for the breath to become something more than just air moving in and out. Even the most basic of these reveals something useful tonight. When the breath is long, the Buddha said, know that it is long. When it is short, know that it is short. Not adjusting it, not improving it, not performing calm through it, simply knowing what is actually happening as it is actually happening, which is already a different relationship to experience than the mind usually maintains. The breath right now is whatever it is. Long or short, deep or shallow, smooth or slightly uneven, whatever is true of this breath in this body tonight. Knowing it without adding anything to it is already sati, already the returning, already sufficient. The mind that was elsewhere is briefly here. Not forced here, not dragged back against resistance. Simply here because something real was offered for it to rest on, and a mind given something genuinely real to rest on will often settle toward it, naturally, the way a hand placed in warm water relaxes without being instructed to. What is actually found in that settling? This question is worth asking directly, because the answer is not what most people expect when they first begin paying attention to the present moment. And the gap between expectation and reality is often what causes people to conclude, incorrectly, that nothing significant is occurring. The present moment is not empty. It is not blank or featureless or waiting to be filled with content that will make it worth inhabiting. When the attention returns to the body and the breath, what it finds is the full texture of being alive right now, considerably richer than the mind's usual motion allows you to notice. The temperature of the air in your nostrils, slightly different from the air in the room. The particular quality of the quiet around you, which is never absolute silence but a layered texture of sounds near and far, some so familiar they have become invisible. The specific feeling of your weight distributed differently across different points of contact, not weight as a general condition, but as a precise and differentiated sensation, different at the shoulders than at the hips, different on one side than the other. None of this requires effort to be present. It is already present. It has been present throughout every moment the mind was occupied elsewhere. The practice of returning does not create this richness. It simply restores your access to something that was never absent, only unattended. The Buddha called this the first foundation of sati, the body in the body. Not the body observed from a distance, as an object of analysis or judgment. The body from inside the body, the direct, immediate, non-conceptual experience of being physically alive right now, which is always available and is never the same twice. This is what Rohitasa had been moving through for 100 years without once stopping to notice. Every moment of his journey contained the full texture of embodied presence, the sensation of movement, the specific quality of each moment's aliveness. He passed through all of it without arriving, because arrival requires stopping long enough to notice where you already are. The richness was never missing from his journey. Only the attention to it was missing. Now, there is a common assumption worth addressing directly. Many people find the practice of returning to the present moment easier when conditions are pleasant or at least neutral, when the day has been manageable and the mind is not under significant pressure. And there is something true in this. The returning does feel less effortful when the emotional weather is calm. But the practice does not become unavailable in difficult conditions. It becomes more important and also more specific. When something genuinely difficult is present, anxiety with a real source, sadness that has not yet worked itself through, the particular weight of a situation that has not resolved, the body is still here. The breath is still arriving. The physical fact of existing in this moment is still available as an anchor. What changes in difficult conditions is simply that the present moment contains something hard. The instruction of the practice is not to overlay that hardness with a forced calm, not to breathe and pretend the difficulty is smaller than it is, not to perform equanimity on top of genuine distress. The Buddha was precise about this. The Satipatthana Sutta explicitly includes difficult mental and emotional states within the scope of what sati attends to, not as conditions to be eliminated before proper practice can begin, but as objects of mindful attention in their own right. When anxiety is present, sati notices. Anxiety is present. When grief is present, sati notices. Grief is present. Not with the additional commentary of this should not be here, or this will never end, or this means something is fundamentally wrong. Simply the clear, direct recognition of what is actually occurring in this body in this moment. The actual experience of a difficult emotion, attended to with sati, is almost always more finite and more workable than the story the mind builds around it. The breath is still arriving. The body is still here. This moment, even carrying its full and undiminished difficulty, is still only this moment, not the next one, not the version of this difficulty that the mind projects forward into an indefinite future. Sati does not resolve the difficulty. It keeps you in contact with the actual size of what is present, rather than the inflated size of what the mind's narration makes it. There is a quality the Buddha named that makes all of this easier, not as a technique, but as a natural orientation that the practice gradually develops. The Pali word is upekkha, most often translated as equanimity, though that English word carries a certain coolness the original does not quite intend. Upekkha is closer to the quality of seeing clearly without being destabilized by what you see. Not indifference, something more like a steady willingness to be with what is actually present, without adding the weight of resistance on top of whatever is already here. What is important to understand about upekkha is that it is not a disposition you adopt by deciding to be more equanimous. It is not an attitude practiced on top of the experience. It develops as a natural consequence of returning to the present moment again and again over time, as a byproduct of the practice, rather than as a prerequisite for it. Each time the mind notices it has wandered and returns without self-criticism, it is practicing, in a small way, the quality of meeting experience without needing it to be other than it is. Each time the returning happens in a moment of difficulty, without demanding the difficulty immediately resolve itself, something in the relationship between the mind and its contents softens slightly. Not dramatically, not permanently, but genuinely, in a way that accumulates over many returnings into something that begins to feel like a different way of being present in your own life. The body, resting right now in whatever position it has found, is already expressing something like upekkha without knowing it. It is not arguing with the temperature of the room or resisting the weight of its own tiredness. It is simply accommodating what is present, making no demand that things be otherwise before it will agree to be here. The invitation of this first teaching is to let the mind do what the body is already doing, to rest in this moment, in this breath, without the additional effort of insisting the moment becomes something else before it is worth fully inhabiting. The Buddha organized sati around 4 foundations, not because 4 is a meaningful number, but because there are 4 genuinely distinct places where presence can be anchored in lived experience, each of them always available, each offering a different quality of ground to return to. The first is the body itself, the breath, the weight, the physical sensation of being alive in this particular form, which is what this section has been exploring. It is the most immediate foundation, the one with the least distance between the instruction and the experience, the one available in any moment without any preparation at all. The second is feeling tone, not emotion in the full sense, but the basic quality of pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral that colors each moment of experience, often below the level of conscious attention, but always present and always informative about where the mind is likely to move next. Noticing this quality, just this experience is pleasant right now, just this one has an unpleasant edge, without immediately acting on it or trying to change it, develops the capacity to be with experience rather than continuously reacting to it. The third is the state of mind itself, whether it is contracted or spacious, agitated or calm, caught in something or relatively clear, seen directly, without judgment, simply as it currently is. Most people pass through many different mind states in a single day without ever clearly knowing what state they are in. The simple act of knowing the mind is restless right now, the mind is tired right now, the mind is clearer than it was an hour ago, creates the minimal distance between awareness and mental state that allows the state to be workable rather than all-consuming. And the fourth is the arising and passing of mental phenomena, thoughts, perceptions, the hindrances when they are present, the qualities of greater clarity when they begin to emerge, witnessed as events occurring within awareness, rather than as the identity of the one who is aware. You do not need to work with all four tonight. The breath is enough. The weight of the body is enough. Any single point of return, used with consistency and without self-criticism, carries the full quality of the practice. The four foundations are not four things to do simultaneously. They are four doors into the same room. Any one of them opens onto the same presence, the same quality of being here rather than elsewhere, the same arriving that requires nothing beyond the willingness to notice once more where you already are. Feel the breath one more time. This specific inhale, arriving now, filling what it fills, complete in itself before the exhale begins. You did not need to do anything to make it arrive. It came without being summoned, as it has come continuously since the first moment of your life. And in noticing this one breath, this specific, unrepeatable one, you are exactly where Rohitasa finally understood he had always been. Not at the end of 100 years of searching, not at a destination finally reached after sufficient effort. Simply here, in the only moment that has ever actually contained anything real, which has never been anywhere other than exactly where you already are. This is the first teaching, and it lives not in the understanding of it, but in the returning to it. Small, quiet, available in any condition, asking nothing of you other than the willingness to notice once again that you are here. The present moment has not been waiting for you to become ready for it. It has simply been here, as it always is, patient in the way that only something with nowhere else to be can be patient. Rohitasa stopped traveling not by finding a better destination, but by receiving a teaching that showed him where the destination had always been. The body he carried across cosmic distances was never separate from what he was searching for. The breath that sustained him through 100 years of movement was never not the answer. Only the direction of his attention had been wrong, aimed outward and forward, when the only place worth arriving at was already present. In every moment, he was too occupied with traveling to inhabit. His searching moved across space, always outward, always toward a horizon that kept its distance as he moved toward it. But there is a second kind of searching that does not move across space at all, one that operates entirely within time, reaching backward into what has already passed and forward into what has not yet asked anything of you. The particular weight of holding what is already moving away. The specific exhaustion of gripping what cannot be kept. That searching has its own texture, its own quiet gravity, its own way of lifting you out of the present from the inside, rather than across any visible distance. To understand what you are actually carrying when you hold on, and what becomes genuinely lighter when you finally, carefully, with both the honesty and the gentleness this teaching asks for, set it down. That is where the second teaching begins. Everything you have ever loved has already changed in some way you did not choose. The people closest to you are not exactly who they were 5 years ago. Their faces have shifted slightly. Their priorities have rearranged themselves in ways neither of you fully planned. The version of them you first loved, the specific constellation of qualities, habits, and presence that made you feel the way you felt when you first understood how much they mattered to you, that version has been quietly, continuously, inevitably becoming something else. Not worse, necessarily. Not better. Different, in the way that everything alive is always different, from one season to the next, from one year to the next. From the person who went to sleep last night to the person who woke this morning carrying that night's dreams and whatever the body did while the mind was resting. And the places you have loved, the circumstances that once felt exactly right, the version of yourself that existed in a particular chapter of your life and felt in that chapter like the truest version you had yet inhabited. All of it is moving, always, in directions you did not select and cannot reverse. The question the Buddha kept returning to across 45 years of teaching was not whether this movement could be stopped. He was absolutely clear that it could not. But what happens inside a human being who has not yet understood this, and what becomes possible for a human being who finally has. Stand, for a moment, at a gate you do not immediately recognize as significant. It is an ordinary gate outside an ordinary household in a village in ancient India. A monk is standing there with his bowl, waiting. This is a common enough sight. Monks move through villages every morning collecting alms, and householders who offered food were understood to be participating in something mutually beneficial, the monk receiving sustenance and the householder generating merit through generosity. A woman comes to the gate. She looks at the monk. She sees a shaved head, worn robes, a bowl held with the particular quality of stillness that comes from years of practice. She does not see her son. She goes inside and returns with food, which she places in the bowl of the monk who is her son, and she does not know it, and he receives it with the same equanimity he would bring to any alms round in any village, because the monk standing at this gate is genuinely not the young man who once lived inside this house. His name is Rathapala, and his story begins in the Majjhima Nikaya, in one of the most quietly radical accounts of transformation in the entire Pali Canon. He had been, by every measure the world he grew up in valued, exactly what a young man was supposed to be. The wealthiest family in his region, every comfort available, a future already arranged, already promising, already waiting to unfold in the ways that futures in his position were expected to unfold. And then he encountered the Buddha's teachings, not as an intellectual exercise, as something that moved through him with the specific force of a truth that has been waiting a long time for the right conditions to be heard. He went to his parents and asked permission to ordain. They refused. He went back and asked again. They refused again. He asked a third time, and they refused a third time, and so he lay down on the floor of his family's home and stopped eating, telling them that he would die there or he would ordain, and there was no third option he was willing to consider. They relented. Not happily and not without grief, they loved him, and the life they were releasing him toward was not a life they had imagined for him or for themselves. But they relented, and Ratthapala ordained, and he practiced with a commitment that the texts describe as genuine and complete. Years passed. The young man who had grown up in that household became someone else, not by erasing what he had been, but by releasing his identification with it, by loosening his grip on the fixed self that had been built from the expectations of his family, the wealth of his circumstances, the story his culture had written for him before he was old enough to know a story was being written. When he returned to his home village, he went on alms round as he would anywhere. He arrived at his parents' gate. His mother did not recognize him. She gave him food and went back inside, and the monk standing at the gate received it the way he received everything, with gratitude, without grasping, without the particular pain that would have accompanied this moment for a man still clinging to the identity of son, still needing his family to see him in a particular way in order to feel complete. Eventually, he was recognized by a former wife who looked more carefully and saw through the shaved head and the robes to the features she had known. Word reached his parents. There was a reunion. And here is where the teaching becomes most precise. Ratthapala was glad to see his family. He ate with them. He spoke with them. The love that had always been present between them did not require the clinging to function. He had not become indifferent to the people he had grown up among. He had simply stopped needing them to be a particular way in order for his own interior to remain at peace. This is the distinction at the heart of the second teaching, and it is one of the most practically important distinctions the Buddha ever drew. Attachment and love are not the same thing. They feel similar, especially from the inside, especially in the early stages of caring about something or someone. Both involve a turning toward, a warmth, an investment of attention and energy in something outside yourself. But they operate by completely different principles and produce completely different qualities of experience over time. Love, in the Buddhist understanding, is a genuine orientation toward the well-being of what is loved, a warmth that does not require a particular response in order to remain warm, a care that does not need to control its object in order to continue caring. Attachment, the Pali word is upadana, which means clinging or grasping, is something layered on top of love, the demand that what is loved remain exactly as it is, the insistence that the person or situation or feeling stay constant in the face of a world that is constitutionally incapable of staying constant. Upadana does not arise from the depth of caring. It arises from fear, the fear that if something changes, what was loved will be lost entirely. The fear that the self built around a particular relationship or circumstance will not survive the relationship or circumstance changing. The fear that there is nothing beneath the clinging that would remain if the thing being clung to were no longer available in exactly the form it currently takes. The Buddha described the experience of upadana with a precision that makes it immediately recognizable in ordinary experience. He said that the world is swept away and does not endure, that it has no shelter and no protector, that it has nothing of its own. Everything must be passed on, leaving everything behind, and that it is incomplete, insatiate, the slave of craving. These 4 observations, which Ratthapala later taught to a king named Kauravya as the essence of everything he had understood, are not pessimistic assessments of life's value. They are precise descriptions of what the clinging mind keeps discovering and keeps refusing to accept. The world is swept away and does not endure. You have already experienced this more times than you can count. Circumstances you worked hard to build have shifted in ways you did not plan for. People you expected to remain have moved on in one way or another. Versions of yourself that felt permanent turned out to be particular to a particular chapter. The mind that understands this clearly is not a mind in despair. It is a mind that has stopped being surprised by what was always going to be true, which is a very different quality of experience from the one that meets every change with the specific shock of something that should not have happened. The world has no shelter and no protector. This one cuts deeper because it addresses the belief that underlies most of the strategies the mind develops for managing the impermanence it does not want to accept. If you can just arrange enough security, enough stability, enough people in the right positions caring about you in the right ways, perhaps the sweeping away can be held off long enough to feel safe. The Buddha was not dismissing the genuine value of care or relationship or good circumstances. He was pointing at the specific suffering that comes from treating these things as permanent shelters when they are, by their nature, temporary ones. Seeking protection is not the problem. Believing you have found complete and permanent protection is where the suffering waits. The world has nothing of its own, and one must pass on, leaving everything behind. Ratthapala, standing at his parents' gate with a bowl in his hands, unrecognized by the people who loved him most, is the image of this teaching made visible. He had passed on, not in the sense of death, but in the sense of genuine change. The self his family had known had been replaced, through practice and understanding, by something they could not immediately locate in the face in front of them. And in his willingness to stand there without requiring them to recognize him, in his capacity to receive food from his own mother without the specific pain of invisibility, was the evidence of what had actually been released. And the world is incomplete, insatiate, the slave of craving. This is the one most people feel in their bodies before they can name it in their minds. The quality of experience in which the thing obtained does not quite deliver what the wanting of it promised, in which the arrival at a goal produces a brief satisfaction followed quickly by the identification of the next goal, as though the completion of one desire simply creates the space for the next desire to announce itself. Not because something is wrong with the person experiencing this, but because this is the structural nature of craving itself. It does not know how to be finished, because being finished is not what it is designed to do. Ratthapala understood all 4 of these things, not as philosophical propositions, but as lived experiences. He had grown up in a household of complete material sufficiency and discovered, in encountering the Buddha's teachings, that sufficiency of that kind did not reach the particular incompleteness he felt at the center of his experience. This is what made the teachings land with such force that he was willing to stop eating rather than be prevented from following them. He recognized, in what the Buddha described, the exact shape of something he had been living with for as long as he could remember, but had never previously had words for. Now bring this close to your own experience, not as a spiritual exercise, but as an honest piece of self-examination. Where in your life right now is the grip tightest? It might be a relationship, the specific configuration of someone in your life that you need to remain exactly as it currently is, the particular quality of how they are with you that you are already, perhaps unconsciously, working to preserve against the changes that are quietly occurring anyway. It might be a version of yourself, a self-image built around something you have achieved, or a role you perform, or a story you carry about who you are and what you are capable of. A story that has to be maintained through continuous effort because the evidence that might complicate it keeps arriving and has to be managed. It might be a circumstance, a living arrangement, a professional situation, a particular quality of daily life that feels essential to your well-being in a way that makes the thought of its changing feel genuinely threatening rather than simply unwelcome. Whatever the grip is, and there is almost certainly one, because this is the condition of a mind that has not yet received the teaching Rathapala spent years embodying, notice the quality of energy it requires. Maintaining a grip is effortful in a way that is easy to stop noticing when the effort has been ongoing long enough to feel normal. A hand held in a fist for a long time forgets what it feels like to be open. The tension becomes the baseline, and from that baseline, opening feels like loss rather than relief, because the tension has been present for so long that its absence registers as emptiness rather than as space. The Buddha's teaching on anicca, impermanence, is most often encountered as a warning. Everything changes, nothing lasts. Hold things lightly because loss is inevitable. This framing is not wrong, but it is incomplete, and the incompleteness is where most people's relationship with the teaching stops being useful. A warning about inevitable loss produces either anxiety or a kind of numb resignation, neither of which is what the teaching is pointing toward. The full teaching is something different. Impermanence is not only a description of what will eventually cause suffering if things are held too tightly. It is simultaneously the description of why suffering itself does not last, why difficult states are as impermanent as pleasant ones, why the very quality that makes joy feel fragile also makes pain feel finite. When the Buddha described the world as swept away and not enduring, he was not delivering a verdict on the worthlessness of experience. He was describing the complete picture that a mind which has genuinely understood impermanence does not only grieve the passing of what was good, it also recognizes in real time that what is difficult is passing too. That the heaviness present tonight is moving, as everything moves, toward its own conclusion. That the resistance to what is hard is itself a form of clinging, holding the difficult thing in place through the energy of fighting it, prolonging the suffering by insisting it should not be present rather than allowing it, the impermanence that belongs to it as surely as it belongs to everything else. The relief in impermanence is available to you right now, not as a consolation but as a genuine perceptual shift. Whatever is difficult at this moment in your life, whatever has brought a particular weight into the body you are resting in tonight, is moving. Not necessarily quickly, not necessarily in the direction you would choose, but moving as everything moves, because the nature of all conditioned phenomena is to arise, to exist for a time, and to pass. The suffering is not in the moving. The suffering is in the resistance to the moving, in the grip that insists this moment, this configuration, this version of things must be held in place when the nature of reality is to flow. What does it actually feel like in the body when attachment releases? This is a question worth asking in physical terms rather than philosophical ones, because the answer is more specific and more immediately useful than most descriptions of spiritual liberation suggest. It does not feel like emptiness. This is the most common misunderstanding, and it is the one that makes people most reluctant to loosen a grip they already sense is costing them something. The assumption is that if you stop holding so tightly to what you love, what remains will be a kind of hollowness, the absence of the intensity that the clinging produced, the flat affect of someone who has stopped caring. But this is not what the release of attachment produces, and Rathapala, standing at his parents' gate, is the evidence. He was glad to see them. He ate with them. The warmth between them was real and present, and required no clinging to sustain it. What was absent was not the love. What was absent was the anxiety that always accompanies love, held in a fist rather than love held in an open hand. The actual felt quality of attachment releasing is closer to the feeling of setting down something heavy you had been carrying for so long you stopped registering its weight. There is a moment when a heavy bag is finally removed from a shoulder that has been bearing it for hours, in which the shoulder does not immediately feel light, it feels briefly strange, as though the absence of the weight is itself a sensation that requires adjustment. And then, a few moments later, a lightness arrives that would have been impossible to accurately imagine while the bag was still being carried, because the carrying had become so constant that the weight had been absorbed into the baseline of what normal felt like. This is what the texts are pointing at when they describe the quality of experience in someone who has genuinely understood impermanence and loosened the grip of upadana. Not the absence of caring, not the elimination of preference, not the flat neutrality of someone who has trained themselves not to feel. A specific lightness that comes from no longer spending the energy of fighting what is already moving, from no longer maintaining the fist that was costing more than was ever acknowledged while it was being maintained. The middle path the Buddha described between clinging and indifference is not a midpoint on a spectrum between two extremes. It is a qualitatively different relationship to experience altogether, one that does not appear on the spectrum at all, because it operates by different principles than either of the extremes it replaces. Clinging says, "This must remain exactly as it is, and if it changes, I will suffer." Indifference says, "Nothing matters enough to be worth caring about, and loss cannot hurt what is already numb." The middle path says something entirely different. "I love this fully, right now, in the form it currently takes, and I release my demand that it remain this way." Because the loving and the releasing are not in conflict. They are both expressions of a mind that has understood what love actually is and what it actually requires. Rathapala loved his family. The love was real. The reunion was genuine. The warmth he brought to eating with them, to speaking with them, to being present in the place where he had grown up, none of this was performed equanimity, overlaying inner coldness. It was the warmth available to a person who no longer needed a particular response from the people he loved in order to remain inwardly at peace. Who could receive food from his own mother without the specific pain of invisibility, because his sense of being complete did not depend on being seen in any particular way by any particular person? This completeness is not an achievement reserved for monks who have spent years in dedicated practice. It is available in smaller increments, in any ordinary moment in which the grip loosens slightly and something is allowed to be what it is, rather than what the mind insists it must be. The next time you notice the grip tightening, the next time you feel the specific anxiety of something you love showing signs of changing in a direction you did not choose, try, just as a brief experiment, to stay with the sensation in the body rather than immediately moving to manage the situation the sensation is responding to. Not suppressing the anxiety, not overriding it with a spiritual idea about impermanence. Simply noticing where it lives in the body, what shape it has, what it actually feels like in the chest or the throat or the stomach, which is always more specific and more workable than the story the mind immediately begins building around it. In that moment of noticing, something small but genuine becomes possible. The sensation and the story about the sensation are briefly separated. The body's response and the mind's interpretation of that response are, for just a moment, distinct from each other. And in that gap, brief as it is, the quality of open hands becomes available as something more than a metaphor, as an actual physical momentary choice to hold this right now, without requiring it to be anything other than what it currently is. This is not the full liberation Rathapala embodied after years of genuine practice. It is a single breath of it, available in an ordinary moment, requiring nothing except the willingness to notice the grip and try, just this once, to soften it by one small degree. And that 1 degree is real. It is not a consolation prize for those who cannot manage the full teaching. It is the full teaching in the form currently available, which is always the only form that matters. The monk standing at his parents' gate with a bowl in his hands, unrecognized by the people who had known him longest, was not demonstrating the erasure of love. He was demonstrating what love looks like when it has been freed from the anxiety of clinging, when it no longer needs the beloved to perform constancy in the face of inevitable change, when it no longer requires a particular recognition in order to remain warm, when it can be given freely, received freely, and held in open hands rather than closed ones. Everything you have ever loved has already changed in some way you did not choose. This is not a tragedy. It is the nature of everything alive. And within that nature, within the movement that cannot be stopped and was never meant to be stopped, there is a way of loving that does not depend on the movement ceasing. A way of caring that costs less, holds more, and remains available even as the specific forms it attaches to continue their inevitable becoming. This is what Rathapala found standing at a gate he had passed through countless times as a child, receiving alms from his own mother's hands, bringing no demand to the exchange that it be anything other than exactly what it was. Not cold, not distant, simply free in a way that did not require freedom from love, but discovered freedom within it. Rathapala's transformation did not come from discipline applied from the outside in. He did not practice detachment by gritting his teeth and forcing himself to care less. What changed was something quieter and more fundamental than any effort of will could produce. The way he spoke to himself in difficult moments, the quality of attention he brought to his own experience when no one was watching, the interior relationship between himself and his own imperfections that had to shift before anything in his outward relationship to the world could shift alongside it. Non-attachment toward the world grows naturally from something that has to begin closer to home, from the way we meet ourselves in the private hours, in the moments of failure and confusion and falling short of what we had hoped to be. And that is where the third teaching takes us now. You know the voice. It does not arrive through the ears. It runs inside the mind, in the private hours, in the specific darkness of 3 a.m, when sleep has gone somewhere else, and the mind has decided, without consulting you, that now is the ideal time to conduct a thorough audit of everything you have done wrong. It replays conversations with a precision that ordinary memory rarely achieves. It isolates the exact sentence you should not have said, the moment you hesitated when you should have been certain, the expression that crossed someone's face in response to something you did, and which you have since interpreted and reinterpreted without arriving at any conclusion that reflects well on you. It compares you to versions of yourself that existed only in imagination, the version that would have handled the situation better, said the right thing at the right moment, not needed to apologize afterward. And it delivers its findings as verdicts, in language you would never use with someone you cared about, in a tone that assumes its own authority without ever having earned it. Most people live with this voice for so long that they stop questioning whether it is telling the truth. It sounds like self-awareness. It sounds like the honest internal accounting that responsible people perform in order to become better. It sounds, most persuasively of all, like your own voice, because it uses the first person, because it knows details about you that no external critic could access, because it has been present for as long as you can remember, and familiarity has a way of manufacturing the impression of authority. The Buddha made a distinction that changes how this voice is understood. The mind is malleable. Its patterns were shaped by conditions, by what was taught, what was modeled, what was rewarded, and what was punished in the environment that formed you before you had any say in how the forming was conducted. A voice that was conditioned into existence is not the same thing as a voice that is telling the truth. She had done everything right. By every standard her world offered for measuring the worth of a woman's conduct, Isidasi had met and exceeded what was asked of her. She rose before the household woke. She prepared the food, cleaned the floors, arranged the offerings, served her husband's parents with the same care she would have brought to her own. She was devoted, attentive, and thorough in everything the role required of her. Her husband sent her home after a month. He told her father she was unbearable to live with. He offered no further explanation, or if he did, none survived in the account Isidasi later gave in her own words. What survived was the bare fact she had tried, fully and with everything she had, and it had not been enough, and she did not understand why. Her family found her a second husband. She brought the same care to the second household that she had brought to the first. After 2 months, he left. Her family found her a third husband. The same outcome followed. A fourth man was proposed and refused to marry her at all, before any household had been shared, before any conduct could have given him a reason. What accumulates across those 4 refusals is not merely disappointment at circumstances. It is the specific and corrosive conclusion that something is fundamentally wrong with the person at the center of the pattern. The common element across 4 failures becomes, in the mind that is doing the accounting, evidence rather than coincidence. If this keeps happening despite doing everything correctly, the problem must lie somewhere deeper than behavior, somewhere in the nature of the person herself, somewhere that trying harder cannot reach, because trying harder is already what she has been doing, and it has not changed anything. The inner critic operates by exactly this logic. It takes a pattern of outcomes and converts it into a verdict about the self. It moves from what happened to what it means, and what it means always points in the same direction, inward, toward a conclusion about fundamental inadequacy that the evidence is then arranged to support regardless of how the evidence actually reads. Isidasi had no framework that would have allowed her to separate what had happened to her from what she had decided it meant about her. She simply lived inside the conclusion, the way most people live, inside their inner critic's verdicts, not as a philosophy consciously held, but as the invisible background against which all other experience is arranged. What changed was an encounter. A bhikkhuni named Jinadatta came through the city where Isidasi was living, and Isidasi saw her on alms round and invited her to eat at her family's home. Something in that encounter, in the quality of presence the nun carried, in the teaching that followed the meal, in the particular way the Dharma landed in someone who had been living inside a verdict about herself for long enough to have stopped questioning its accuracy, cracked something open that had been sealed for years. The Therigatha is one of the oldest surviving collections of verse composed by women in any literary tradition in the world. It preserves, in the voices of the women themselves, accounts of suffering and practice and liberation that carry the weight of first-person testimony rather than the weight of being reported through someone else's interpretation. Isidasi's verses, 447 through the close of her account, are remarkable not only for the detail of what she describes, but for the quality of unflinching honesty she brings to it. She does not minimize what she experienced. She does not perform a liberation that glosses over the years of confusion and self-condemnation that preceded it. She gives the full account, including the parts that do not reflect well on who she was before she understood what she was actually dealing with. What she came to understand, through the practice she took up after that encounter with Jinadatta, was something the Buddha had taught with great precision across many different contexts. The mind that is currently judging you is not the final authority on who you are. It is a conditioned instrument shaped by what it has been through, running patterns that were established before you were old enough to examine them, producing verdicts that feel authoritative because they are delivered in your own voice, but carrying no more inherent accuracy than any other conditioned pattern the mind runs without being asked to. The Buddha described the untrained mind with an image that makes this concrete. He compared it to a fish thrown from water onto dry land, thrashing, reactive, unable to settle, responding to everything and resting in nothing. An untrained mind is not a broken mind, any more than a fish on dry land is a broken fish. It is a mind in the wrong conditions, responding to those conditions in the only ways currently available to it. The training of metta, of loving kindness, directed first inward and then outward, does not fix the mind by correcting its faults one by one. It changes the conditions from the inside, which changes what the mind naturally produces without requiring constant effortful intervention. There is a teaching in the Anguttara Nikaya that is rarely encountered outside formal practice settings, but which provides the doctrinal foundation for why metta works at all. The Buddha said, "Luminous is the mind, and it is defiled by incoming defilements." The original nature of the mind, before the conditioning, before the critic's patterns were installed, before the environment left its particular marks on what the mind learned to produce automatically, is not one of judgment and inadequacy. It is luminous. What the inner critic delivers is not the mind's original voice. It is the incoming defilement of conditioned patterns that arrived from outside and settled so thoroughly into the interior landscape that they began to sound like the self they were criticizing. The practice of metta does not manufacture a new quality of mind from nothing. It returns the mind, incrementally and genuinely, toward a quality that was present before the conditioning covered it. The luminosity is not something to be achieved. It is something to be uncovered, one returning at a time, one compassionate turning inward at a time, until what was always underneath becomes easier and easier to find. The Karaniya Metta Sutta, one of the most beloved texts in the entire Theravada tradition, opens with an image that most people encounter as instruction about how to treat others and overlook as instruction about how to treat themselves. The Buddha described the quality of care to be cultivated as the care of a mother for her only child, a mother who would protect her child with her own life, who would place her child's well-being above her own without calculation or condition, who would not withdraw her love based on the child's performance or the child's adequacy by any external standard. The practice of metta is designed to cultivate exactly this quality, and the instruction in the sutta is specific about where the cultivation begins, not with difficult people, not with strangers, not with the abstract category of all beings everywhere, but with yourself. The traditional phrases begin in the first person. May I be happy. May I be well. May I be free from suffering. May I live with ease. These are not affirmations designed to override difficult feelings with positive ones. They are a turning of the mother's quality of care back toward the one who is practicing, who is as deserving of that care as any being the practice is eventually extended toward. For most people, this is the hardest direction. Extending care toward others, toward people who are suffering, toward people in difficulty, feels natural, feels like what compassion is for. Turning the same quality of care inward, toward one's own suffering and one's own struggle, activates a resistance that sounds, when it speaks, remarkably reasonable. A voice that says, "This is self-indulgence." That genuine practice should be directed outward, toward beings whose suffering is real and significant. That the discomfort being experienced is probably deserved, and cushioning it with self-directed compassion is a way of avoiding the accountability that would actually produce change. Look carefully at that resistance. It has dressed itself in the language of responsibility and spiritual seriousness, and in that costume, it sounds far more credible than it actually is. What it is actually doing is defending the inner critic's authority by framing self-compassion as weakness and self-punishment as rigor. The two have been confused so thoroughly in most people's interior lives that separating them feels almost counterintuitive. The Buddha never taught that suffering should be accepted without examination, or that difficult feelings should be indulged without wisdom. He also never taught that harsh internal judgment produces genuine transformation. He taught, with consistency across decades of teaching, that the quality of understanding which produces real change arises from clear, compassionate attention, the kind that allows what is actually present to be seen without the distortion that fear and self-condemnation introduce. Pressure applied from the inside does not produce clarity. It produces more pressure. Isidasi's inner critic had been building its case across 4 marriages worth of evidence. The case was detailed, the evidence was specific, and the conclusion had the authority that only years of repetition can manufacture. What Jinadatta's teaching offered was not a counter-argument. It offered a different relationship to the voice itself, a way of seeing the verdict as a conditioned pattern rather than as a direct transmission of truth. Recognizing that the voice is conditioned is completely different from deciding it is wrong. It simply removes the assumption of authority that the voice has been operating under all along. Here is where the distinction between self-compassion and self-excuse becomes important to name clearly. Self-excuse says, "The thing that happened was not my responsibility. The verdict is simply incorrect. I am not the problem here, and the evidence can be reinterpreted to show it." Self-compassion says something entirely different. Something difficult happened, and I am in pain about it. And the pain is real and deserves to be met with care rather than with a second layer of suffering applied on top of it in the form of relentless self-judgment. Self-compassion does not require deciding that nothing was your fault. The facts can be examined clearly, and the learning available in them can be taken seriously. All of that remains intact. What self-compassion removes is the requirement that the examination be conducted by a prosecutor rather than a witness. A witness sees what happened. A prosecutor builds a case. The suffering does not require a case to be built against it in order to be taken seriously. The Buddha described this quality with the Pali word karuna, compassion, defined as the wish for beings to be free from suffering, accompanied by a genuine orientation toward that freedom. The emphasis in the definition matters. It is a wish for freedom from suffering, not a judgment about whether the suffering is warranted, not a calculation of how much compassion the amount of suffering has earned. Simply the recognition of suffering and the wish that it ease. When this is extended inward, when you are the being whose suffering is being recognized, something in the interior landscape shifts in a way that effortful self-improvement never quite reaches. Bring this into your own experience right now. Is there something you have been carrying about yourself that the inner critic has been delivering verdicts on? You do not need to examine the content of the verdict tonight. Simply notice its presence, the specific weight it adds to the body when it is active. the particular quality of contraction that happens somewhere in the chest or the shoulders when the voice runs its familiar assessment and arrives, as it always arrives, at the same conclusion it has been reaching for as long as you can remember. Notice that weight if it is present. Allow it to be noticed without immediately moving to analyze or resolve it. Simply, this is here, in this body, as a physical reality with weight and location and texture. And then try, for this one breath, to bring toward that weight the quality the Karaniya Metta Sutta describes, the quality of a mother toward her only child. The wish extended inward without requiring any prior condition to be met. May I be free from this. Not because the verdict that produced it is definitely wrong. Not because the circumstances that generated it no longer matter. Simply because suffering is suffering, and the wish for its easing does not need a prior determination of worthiness before it is allowed to arise. May I be happy. May I be well. May I be free from suffering. May I live with ease. When these phrases are first offered inward, the experience is often not immediately warm. For many people, the initial response is awkwardness, a sense that the words are landing on something that does not quite know how to receive them, a slight stiffness in the interior, as though care directed inward is arriving in a space that has been arranged for something else entirely. This is not failure, it is information. The awkwardness is simply the resistance of a mind that has been organized around judgment for a long time, encountering a different instruction for the first time. A door that has been closed for years does not open smoothly on the first attempt. The practice is not to force it open, but to keep returning to it, gently, without demand, offering the phrases again not as a command, but as an invitation that the interior is entirely free to accept at whatever pace it finds possible. Each time the invitation is offered without requiring a particular response, the door moves slightly. The luminosity the Anguttara Nikaya describes does not appear all at once. It emerges incrementally, in small moments of genuine warmth that surprise the mind accustomed to finding something else in that direction entirely. These phrases, spoken inward toward yourself, carry the full weight of the practice the Buddha described in the Karaniya Metta Sutta. They are not a shortcut or a simplified version for beginners. They are the practice in the form the Buddha offered it, beginning exactly where he said it should begin, with the one offering the care who is also the one who needs it most. What Isidasi found through sustained practice was not a reconstruction of her self-image built on better evidence. A counter-narrative that explained the 4 marriages in a way that left her blameless was not what changed her life. What changed was her relationship to the voice that had been delivering verdicts about her fundamental inadequacy for years. She did not stop examining her experience. She stopped treating the inner critic's conclusions as the last word on what the examination meant. The Therigatha records her liberation as complete. She became a bhikkhuni herself and eventually taught others, and the account she left behind in her own verses is one of the most honest and useful documents in the entire Buddhist canon for anyone who has ever wondered whether the voice they live with inside their own head is as authoritative as it sounds. It is not. It is conditioned, and like everything conditioned, it is subject to change. The practice of metta, beginning with yourself, the one being in your care who most often receives the least of it, is one of the most direct paths the Buddha described for changing those conditions from within. Self-forgiveness is closely related to metta, but distinct from it in a way worth naming. The Buddha was clear that right action and its consequences are real, and the teaching does not ask you to pretend otherwise. The learning available from difficulty is real and worth extracting carefully. What is not required, what the teaching specifically does not require, is continuing to punish yourself for an action long after any useful learning has been taken from examining it. The Buddha used a precise image for the cost of self-punishment. He described a person who picks up a burning coal with the intention of throwing it at someone who has wronged them. The coal burns the hand of the person holding it regardless of where it is ultimately aimed. Self-punishment works the same way. It burns the one who is holding it continuously, and the burning does not produce the change it promises, because real change comes from understanding, not from the sustained application of pain to the place where the failure occurred. Setting down the coal is not pretending the fire was not real. The learning available from having picked it up does not disappear when the holding ends. What disappears is the burning, which was never doing what it was supposed to do in the first place. The Buddha also described what he called the near enemy of compassion, not cruelty, which is obviously distinct, but grief. The quality of feeling so overwhelmed by suffering that witnessing it collapses into being consumed by it. The near enemy resembles the genuine quality closely enough to be confused with it, which is why it is worth naming carefully. Self-compassion is not the same as dwelling inside the pain without the clear seeing that genuine karuna requires. It is possible to use self-compassion as permission to remain inside difficulty indefinitely, to circle the suffering without the orientation toward its easing that the practice actually describes. The practice asks for something more precise than that. Meet the suffering with warmth, recognize it clearly, hold the wish for its easing genuinely, and then allow the attention to remain steady rather than collapsing into what it is witnessing. Compassion that is absorbed by the suffering loses its capacity to do what compassion is for. The mother does not become the child's wound. She tends it. Isidasi set down the coal. Through the practice of metta, applied consistently and honestly toward the being who needed it most and had received it least, herself, something that had been sealed for years gradually opened. What emerged from that opening was not the absence of accountability, but the presence of clarity, the capacity to look at her own experience without the distortion that self-condemnation introduces, to see what had actually happened rather than what the verdict said it meant, to understand without the understanding requiring her to remain in pain as proof that she was taking it seriously. There is a particular exhaustion that most people carry without naming it as exhaustion. The exhaustion of being your own harshest critic continuously, of maintaining the prosecution of yourself across every domain in which you have ever fallen short, of never extending to yourself the same benefit of the doubt you offer automatically to the people around you when they make the same kinds of errors you refuse to forgive yourself for making. This exhaustion is real, and it has weight in the body, and it deserves to be acknowledged directly rather than treated as the ordinary cost of taking yourself seriously. It is not the ordinary cost of taking yourself seriously. It is the cost of a specific habit, the habit of placing yourself outside the circle of compassion you would naturally extend to any other being in the same situation. The practice the Buddha described is straightforward in its structure, even when it is demanding in its application. Begin with yourself. Begin here with the self as it currently is, imperfect, still learning, carrying things it has not yet set down, but present and real, and deserving of the same wish for well-being that the Karanaya Metta Sutta extends without condition to all beings everywhere. The beginning does not require that you first become more worthy of it. It requires only the willingness to try in this moment, in this body, on this evening. The warmth you extend toward others when they are suffering, the wish for their ease that arises naturally when you see someone in genuine difficulty, is not a quality reserved for your relationships with other people. It belongs equally to your relationship with yourself. You have simply been treating yourself as the exception to it for longer than was ever necessary or useful. Isidasi stopped making that exception. Through practice, through the cultivation of an attention that met her own suffering with care rather than condemnation, through the slow and real work of turning inward the compassion that had always been available but had rarely been aimed in the right direction, something shifted. Standing inside her own experience with that quality of care rather than that quality of judgment, she found something the verdict had been obscuring all along. Something quiet, something steady, something that did not depend on any particular outcome for its presence. Something that was, in the most direct and unadorned sense, simply here. In the verses she left behind, Isidasi reflected on how liberation changed not only her relationship to herself, but her relationship to impermanence itself. The same changes that had once registered as failures, as evidence of her fundamental inadequacy, as proof that something was irreparably wrong, became, after liberation, simply movements of conditioned phenomena arising and passing in the way that conditioned phenomena do. The marriages had come. The marriages had ended. What she had believed they meant about her turned out to be something the mind had added on top of them, not something inherent in them. The impermanence that had previously felt like loss began to feel like freedom, because a self, no longer gripping its own story, does not need the story to have gone differently in order to be at peace with how it went. This thread will return in what comes next, in the section that examines the self that is supposedly doing all this gripping, and what the Buddha said, in the silence of a carefully chosen non-answer, about what that self actually is. Isidasi's liberation arrived not because she changed who she was, but because she stopped confusing herself with the story she had been told about who she was. The story had been assembled from outcomes and verdicts and the conditioned patterns of a mind that had never been offered a different instruction. When a different instruction finally arrived, through Jinadatta, through the practice that followed, the story did not vanish overnight, but it lost its authority. And in that loss of authority, something that had always been present beneath the story became available, a quality of being that did not depend on external validation for its completeness, that did not require 4 marriages to have gone differently in order to remain intact. And this brings the teaching to the edge of the strangest and most liberating question in all of Buddhist thought, the question that a wandering philosopher once asked the Buddha directly, expecting a clear answer, and received instead a silence that carried more weight than any answer could have. Because before the grip on the world can loosen, and before the compassion can fully turn inward, something more fundamental has to be examined. The one who is doing the gripping, the one who is receiving the compassion, the one the inner critic addresses when it speaks in the first person. Who exactly is that? And what happens to the suffering when that question is finally, honestly, followed all the way to where it leads? A question is hanging in the air. Not a complicated question in its grammar, 4 words, asking something philosophers had debated for centuries before this particular afternoon, asking something that most people walking past the conversation would have considered basic and answerable. Is there a self? The man asking it is Vacchagotta, a wandering ascetic who has spent his life collecting answers the way some people collect possessions, accumulating them, comparing them, testing each one against the others to determine which could survive the most rigorous examination. He is known for relentless questioning. He has approached many teachers with this particular question and received answers from all of them. He has come today expecting one more answer to add to the collection, or one more answer to dismantle and discard. The Buddha says nothing. Vacchagotta waits, then asks again, adjusting the question, then is there no self? The Buddha says nothing. Vacchagotta leaves. Confused, perhaps unsatisfied, carrying the silence back into his walking and his questioning as one more thing that has not yet resolved. Ananda, who has been sitting nearby and witnessed the entire exchange, waits until Vacchagotta is gone before asking what he genuinely needs to understand. Why? The Buddha answers every question or declines specific categories of questions for reasons he then explains. This was different. 2 questions, 2 silences, no explanation offered until this moment. The Buddha's answer to Ananda is one of the most carefully constructed passages in the entire Pali Canon. If I had said there is a self, he explained, this would have confirmed the eternalist view, the belief in a fixed, permanent, unchanging essence that persists across time and survives all conditions. If I had said there is no self, this would have pushed Vacchagotta toward nihilism, the belief that nothing persists, nothing connects, nothing carries forward, and therefore nothing matters. Both answers would have been wrong. More precisely, both answers would have been harmful, giving Vacchagotta a position to stand on that would have prevented him from seeing what the silence was pointing at. The silence was not the absence of an answer. The silence was the teaching. Stay with that for a moment. The question, is there a self, feels like one that should have a clear yes or no answer, the kind of question that, once answered definitively, would settle something important about how to live and what to hold on to and what can safely be released. What the Buddha's silence communicated is that the question itself is the problem. It is framed in a way that makes a useful answer impossible because it assumes the answer will be one of 2 things, permanent self or no self, when what is actually true is neither of those things, and requires the grip on both to loosen before it can be seen clearly. This teaching comes from the Sutta Nikaya, and its implications reach into the practical center of how suffering works and how it eases. The thing causing most of the suffering in most human lives is not, in the final analysis, the circumstances themselves. It is the identification with a fixed story about who you are within those circumstances, a story assembled from memories and conclusions and verdicts delivered by experience, held in place with the specific anxiety of someone who believes that if the story changes, they themselves will be lost. The Pali word is anatta, most often translated as no self or not self, and it is the most consistently misunderstood teaching in the entire Buddhist tradition. Most people who encounter it for the first time hear it as a claim that they do not exist, that the sense of being a particular person with a particular history and particular relationships and a particular way of meeting the world is simply an illusion to be seen through and discarded. The teaching is more precise and more useful than that, and the difference between what it actually says and what it is commonly understood to say is exactly the difference between confusion and liberation. Anatta does not mean you do not exist. It means you are not fixed. And the fixedness, the belief in a permanent, unchanging, essentially defined self that has always been this way and will always be this way, is precisely where the suffering is rooted. Consider what the belief in a fixed self produces in ordinary experience. Someone criticizes something you have done, and the mind immediately converts this into a statement about who you are. Not, I made an error in judgment in this situation, but I am the kind of person who makes this kind of error. A relationship ends, and the mind converts it into evidence about your fundamental worth. Not, this particular connection did not sustain itself, but I am someone who cannot keep people close. A version of yourself that performed well at something begins to feel like the real you, which means any performance falling short of that version threatens not just the outcome, but the identity. The fixed self is fragile in proportion to how fixed it is, because a self believed to be permanent is a self that can be permanently diminished, permanently defined, permanently trapped inside whatever story the evidence seems to support. The Buddha was not dismissing the reality of experience or the continuity of a life. He was pointing at something more subtle and more liberating. The process of experience is real, the continuity is real, the particular way you meet the world is real. But none of this requires a fixed, permanent essence to be the case. A river is real. Its movement is real. The specific character of a particular river, the way it curves, the speed of its current, the quality of its water, is real and distinguishable from every other river. But there is no fixed, permanent, unchanging river essence separate from the water that is always moving through it. The river is a process, and processes can change without ceasing to be what they are. This is what the Buddha was pointing at with the teaching of dependent origination, paticca samuppada in Pali. Everything that arises in dependence on conditions. Nothing has a fixed, independent, self-contained existence separate from the conditions that give rise to it. This includes you. The particular configuration of qualities, habits, tendencies, and capacities that constitute who you are right now arose in dependence on conditions, on the family you were born into, the experiences that shaped your responses, the practice you have or have not undertaken, the countless causes and effects that produced this particular version of this particular person on this particular evening. The Buddha expressed the heart of this teaching in a formulation that appears repeatedly across the Sutta Nikaya in its simplest form. When this exists, that comes to be, with the arising of this that arises. When this does not exist, that does not come to be, with the cessation of this that ceases. This is not a philosophical abstraction. It is a description of exactly what is happening in your own experience right now. The mood present in this body tonight arose because of specific conditions, the quality of the day that preceded it, the state of the body's tiredness or ease, the last thing the mind encountered before settling into this listening. Change any of those conditions and a different mood arises. The mood is real and the mood is conditioned, and a conditioned mood is not a fixed report on a permanent self. Change the conditions and the person changes. This is not a threat to identity. It is the most genuinely hopeful thing about it. A fixed self could not grow, could not heal, could not practice its way toward greater wisdom or compassion or clarity, because a fixed thing, by definition, cannot move. The process that you actually are can change, because processes respond to conditions, and conditions can be deliberately cultivated. In the Milindapanya, an ancient text recording dialogues between the Greek king Menander and the Buddhist monk Nagasena, there is an image offered for what carries forward across the process of a life without requiring a permanent self to carry it. King Milinda, a sharp and persistent questioner, asks Nagasena to explain what persists across change when there is no fixed self doing the persisting. Nagasena's answer uses an image drawn from a scene familiar to anyone who has attended a festival where lamps are lit sequentially, one flame used to light the next, which lights the next, which lights the next down a long line of lamps, until the last lamp at the far end of the row is burning from a flame that originated at the very beginning of the chain. Is the flame in the last lamp the same flame as the flame in the first? In one sense, no, the flame has moved, the wax has changed, the specific material being consumed is entirely different from the material consumed at the beginning. In another sense, yes, there is a direct causal continuity between the first flame and the last, a chain of arising independence that makes the final lamp a genuine consequence of the first, not a separate and unrelated event. Same flame or different? Neither answer, taken alone, captures what is actually happening. And that is precisely the point. This is the middle way the Buddha was pointing at in his silence with Vacchagotta. The process that you are carries something forward, continuity, consequence, the results of past actions, the particular character shaped by everything that has come before, without any of this requiring a fixed, unchanging self as the carrier. The flame does not need to be the same flame to be genuinely connected to what came before it. You do not need to be a fixed, permanent self for your life to have continuity, meaning, or consequence. What you are not required to be is trapped. And this is where the teaching moves from philosophy into something that can be felt in the body, in the specific quality of a moment when a story about yourself is seen clearly for what it is, not a fixed report on a permanent truth, but a conditioned interpretation assembled from conditions that were never as conclusive as the story made them sound. What does this actually feel like when it happens? The texts do not describe liberation as the gradual dimming of experience or the progressive numbing of emotional response. They describe something closer to the opposite, a lightening, a spaciousness, the specific quality of a mind that is no longer spending its energy maintaining a fixed position against the pressure of everything that keeps threatening to shift it. One of the most practical tools the Buddha offered for seeing the constructed nature of self in direct experience is the teaching on the 5 aggregates, the khandhas. He described what we habitually call self as a collection of 5 distinct processes: form, which is the physical body and its sensations; feeling tone, the basic quality of pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral that colors each moment; perception, the mind's recognition and labeling of experience; mental formations, the volitions, intentions, and habitual reactions that shape how experience is met; and consciousness, the basic awareness present in each moment of knowing. What the Buddha pointed out, with a precision that remains useful in immediate practice, is that none of these 5 are fixed or permanent, and none of them, individually or together, constitute an unchanging self. The body changes moment to moment. Feeling tone shifts with every new contact. Perceptions are shaped by past conditioning and current expectation. Mental formations are habitual, meaning they can change as habits change. Consciousness arises dependently, appearing in response to contact between sense organ and sense object, ceasing when that contact ends. In any given moment, you can ask of any experience, which of these 5 is the self I am defending? The answer, looked at directly, is always the same. None of them, taken alone or together, constitute a fixed and permanent entity that can be permanently diminished by a verdict or permanently completed by an achievement. They are processes, appearing and changing and ceasing in response to conditions. Useful processes, real processes, but not a fixed self. In small, ordinary moments, something like this is available without full liberation as a prerequisite. The next time the inner critic delivers one of its verdicts, the kind that moves from what happened to what it permanently means about who you are, try, just briefly, to notice the moment the verdict is accepted as fixed fact rather than as a conditioned interpretation. There is usually a specific moment in which the mind moves from "this is what occurred" to "this is what I am." It happens quickly, and it has happened so many times that it no longer feels like a move. It feels like a simple recognition of reality, but it is a move. It is the specific move the teaching of anatta is pointing at, the one that converts a process into a verdict, a moment into an identity, a conditioned arising into a permanent definition. Seeing that move, even once, even briefly, changes the relationship to the verdict. Not because the verdict is necessarily wrong, because the verdict's authority to define something fixed and permanent has been, even momentarily, brought into question. A verdict whose authority is in question is a verdict that can be held more lightly, examined rather than accepted, considered rather than inhabited. The story you carry about who you are was assembled from conditions. Some of those conditions were fair and accurate, experiences that genuinely revealed something real about your particular way of being in the world. Others were not, conclusions drawn in moments of pain or confusion, verdicts delivered by people or circumstances that did not have access to the full picture, interpretations shaped more by the state of the interpreter than by the nature of what was being interpreted. The story contains both, woven together so thoroughly that separating them requires a quality of examination that most people never quite find the conditions for, because the story is also the thing doing the examining, which makes the examination circular. The Buddha named this circularity with the Pali word papancha, mental proliferation, and described its mechanism precisely in the Madhupindika Sutta. What a person perceives, they think about. What they think about, they proliferate upon. What they proliferate upon becomes the source of the mental thicket, the dense tangle of interpretations, associations, judgments, and narratives that the mind generates automatically in response to even the simplest contact with experience. A sound is heard. Before the hearing has completed itself, the mind has already labeled it, assessed it, compared it to past sounds, generated a preference about it, and begun building a small narrative about what it means that this particular sound is present in this particular moment. This process happens at a speed that makes it nearly invisible. It feels like perception itself, like the simple recognition of what is there, when it is actually a layer of conditioned elaboration added on top of what is there. The story about the self is papannyika operating at its most consequential level. Raw experience arrives, something happens, something is said, something succeeds or fails, and before the experience has finished occurring, the mind has already generated a narrative about what it means, what it reveals, what it confirms about the fixed entity at the center of the story. Seeing papanka in operation is seeing the story being assembled in real time rather than encountering it as a finished product delivered from some authoritative source. And a story seen being assembled is a story that is obviously, immediately, undeniably constructed, which is a completely different thing from a story accepted as a direct report on permanent reality. The silence Vacchagotta received was more valuable than any answer could have been, precisely because it interrupted papanka at its root. Any answer, yes or no, permanent self or no self, would have given the proliferating mind a new position to elaborate upon, a new fixed point around which to build the next structure of interpretation. The silence gave the proliferating mind nothing to work with. Just the question, hanging in the air, unanswered, with nowhere to go, and in that nowhere, the possibility of a different kind of seeing. Groundlessness is not a pleasant sensation in its initial arrival. The mind, encountering the absence of its usual solid footing, tends to move quickly toward restoring it, reaching for a new position, a new narrative, a new fixed point to serve as the foundation for the next structure of certainty. This is why anatta is so consistently misunderstood. The mind that hears it immediately converts it into either nihilism or a new, fixed identity, both of which restore the solid footing the teaching was designed to remove. The practice is not to achieve a permanent state of groundlessness, which would itself become a fixed position. It is to become more comfortable with the momentary experience of not knowing, the brief interval between one story falling away and the next story arriving, without immediately filling that interval with whatever comes first at hand. In that interval, something is present that is not part of any story. It is present before the story begins and remains after the story ends. It has been present throughout every version of the story you have ever told about yourself, underneath the chapter in which you succeeded, and the chapter in which you failed. Underneath the version that felt most authentically yourself and the version that felt most alien, underneath the self, the inner critic describes, and the self, the best moments have revealed. The Buddha, characteristically, did not offer a positive definition of what this is. He pointed at what it is not fixed, not permanent, not a thing that can be gained or lost, not an essence that requires conditions to be a particular way before it can be present. In the Udana, he described the unborn, the unbecome, the unmade, the unconditioned, not as a metaphysical entity separate from experience, but as the quality of awareness present in every moment of experience, without being identical to the specific content of that experience. The awareness that notices the thought is not the same as the thought it notices. The knowing present in each moment is not the same as the particular thing known in that moment. And this awareness does not require a fixed self to be its source, any more than the river requires a fixed water to be its substance. This is what the flame simile is pointing at, beyond the immediate question Nagasena was addressing. What carries forward across the chain of lamps is not a fixed flame essence, unchanged and unchangeable, preserved perfectly from the first lamp to the last. What carries forward is the capacity for illumination itself, the quality of light, which takes a different form in each lamp while remaining recognizably, genuinely, continuously light. You are more like light than like a lamp. The particular form changes, has been changing since before you could speak, will continue changing until the last condition for this particular process is exhausted. The awareness that the form is the form of does not change in the same way. The knowing, the capacity for experience present in this moment of listening, in this body, on this evening, this was present before the story began and will remain after the last chapter of it has concluded. Letting the story fall away is not an act of self-destruction. It is an act of recognition, the recognition that the story, however useful it has been, however true parts of it are, is not the same as what it is a story about. You are not the narrative the mind has been constructing, any more than a river is the particular water passing through it at this moment. You are the process, the capacity, the continuity that the narrative has been attempting, with the limited tools of language and memory and conditioned interpretation, to describe. Vakagota left the conversation confused. He had come for an answer and received silence, which felt, in the moment, like a failure of the exchange. What the silence had actually done was more valuable than any direct answer could have been. It had removed, briefly, the solid footing of the question itself, creating a groundlessness in which something could be seen that the question, answered either way, would have covered over. He returned to the Buddha on subsequent occasions, as the Pali Canon records across several dialogues. Each time, his questioning had changed slightly, less concerned with accumulating positions, more genuinely open to what a direct encounter with the teaching might reveal. The Buddha met each stage of this evolution with a different kind of instruction, similes on one occasion, the teaching on the aggregates on another, a pointed question returned in place of an answer on a third. What is evident across these encounters is that the confusion Vakagota carried away from the silence was not an obstacle to his understanding, it was the beginning of it. The solid certainty he arrived with had been the obstacle. The confusion was the first crack in it, and in the Pali record, he is eventually described as arriving at the liberation the silence had been pointing toward from the very first unanswered question. The silence did not fail him. It worked more slowly than a direct answer would have, and more thoroughly in the way that things which reach the root tend to work more thoroughly than things that address only the surface. What remains when the story falls away is not an absence. Something has always been underneath it, quieter than thought and more stable than emotion, present before the first word of any chapter was written and remaining after the last word has faded into the silence from which it came. The teachers who have pointed at it across 2.5 millennia have used different words, mapped it through different traditions, approached it through different practices. What they agreed on is this: you cannot travel to it. You cannot achieve it. You can only stop covering it, story by story, verdict by verdict, fixed position by fixed position, until what was always there has enough room to be recognized in the simple, undramatic, completely ordinary quality of being present, here, in this body, in this breath, in this moment, that asks nothing of you except that you stop telling yourself it is not enough. And that is where the fifth teaching takes us now, to the island that was always here, the ground beneath every story, the silence that remains when every question has been set down and nothing is being either searched for or avoided. Not a destination reached after sufficient effort, but a quality available in every moment. The searching and avoiding were briefly, naturally, simply at rest. What would it feel like to stop looking? Not to find what you have been looking for. Not to arrive at the destination the searching has been aimed at for as long as you can remember. Simply to stop the looking itself, to set down the orientation of seeking, the forward lean of a mind always aimed at something not yet here, the particular tension of a person who has been reaching for so long that the reaching has become indistinguishable from the self doing the reaching. Take a breath and stay with that question rather than immediately filling it with an answer. Not what you would find if you stopped looking, not whether stopping is possible or advisable or spiritually correct. Just the question itself, held open, like a hand that has finally unclenched after a long time of holding something tightly, the specific quality of that unclenching, which is its own kind of experience before anything else arrives to fill the open space. The mind will want to answer quickly. That is what trained minds do with open questions. They close them efficiently and automatically, because an open question feels, to a mind organized around resolution, like a problem waiting to be solved. The instruction here is simply to let it stay open for one more breath, to notice what the openness itself feels like before the answer arrives to replace it. This question has been asked before, in different words, in a form so precise and so old that it has survived more than 2,500 years of transmission without losing any of its original weight. A young man named Kappa asked it on a dusty road in ancient India, after years of traveling and studying and preparing, carrying it toward the one teacher his own teacher believed could answer it. Kappa was one of 16 students belonging to the wandering teacher Bharvari, a Brahmin of great learning who had assembled a circle of dedicated disciples and spent years transmitting whatever wisdom he had gathered across a lifetime of practice. When word reached Bharvari that the Buddha was teaching in the north, he sent his 16 best students to find him and ask the questions that mattered most. Each student carried a carefully prepared question, shaped by years of study, designed to reach toward the deepest understanding their tradition had made available to them. Kappa's question was this: for being swept away by the flood, by old age, by sickness, by death, by grief, where is the island of safety? Tell me, out of compassion, where this island is, so that this suffering does not happen again. The flood Kappa described was not water. It was the current that carries every human life, the current of change, of loss, of the body's gradual diminishment, of the people and circumstances that arrive and then are gone, of the gap between what is wanted and what is, which opens and closes across every chapter of a life without ever quite resolving into permanent satisfaction. He was asking for something that would hold against this current, a place to stand that the flood could not reach, ground that would not shift under the weight of everything that shifts. The Buddha's answer in the Sutta Nipata is one of the most compressed and complete responses in the entire Pali Canon. He did not describe a location. He did not offer a path of many steps leading eventually to a distant destination. He said, "The island, Kappa, is this, possessing nothing, clinging to nothing. This is Nibbana, I declare, the utter decay of old age and death. Possessing nothing, clinging to nothing." The island Kappa was searching for was not a place the flood had not yet reached. It was not somewhere to travel to in order to be safe from the current. The island was the condition of non-clinging itself, the quality of a mind that has stopped adding its own, reaching to the natural movement of things, that has released the demand that what is impermanent become permanent, that has set down the forward lean of a self always aimed at what is not yet here. When the reaching ceases, even temporarily, what remains is the island. And the island, the Buddha's answer makes clear, has always been here. The flood was never the problem. The gripping in the face of the flood was the problem. And the gripping can release in any moment, not because the conditions of life have finally become favorable enough to make releasing possible, but because the releasing was always available, independent of conditions, requiring nothing from circumstances before it could occur. This is the fifth teaching tonight, and it is in some ways the destination toward which the previous four have been moving. The first teaching asked you to return to the body, to the breath, to the present moment that the searching mind keeps passing through on its way somewhere else. The second asked you to loosen the grip on what is already changing, to discover that love held in open hands is warmer than love held in a fist. The third turned the compassion inward, toward the one who has been living under the inner critic's jurisdiction for longer than was ever necessary. The fourth asked you to look at the story itself, to see it as assembled from conditions rather than delivered as a permanent report on a fixed self. And now this one brings all of them to their natural resting place, the quality of awareness that is present when the searching is not, which has been here throughout every moment of the searching, which does not need to be found because it has never been lost. The Pali name for this quality is Nibbana, and it is the most misrepresented word in the entire Buddhist vocabulary. In popular usage, it has come to mean a state of permanent bliss, attained after decades of dedicated monastic practice by people of exceptional spiritual capacity, something remote, something earned, something belonging to another category of human being entirely. The Buddha's own usage is considerably more immediate. Across the Pali Canon, he described Nibbana not only as the final liberation of a fully awakened being, but as the quality of mind available in any moment when clinging is absent, when the three fires of greed, aversion, and delusion are not currently burning. The word itself means extinguishing, the extinguishing of the fires. And the fires can be absent, temporarily, but genuinely, in any ordinary moment of any ordinary life, in a breath taken without demand, in a moment of resting without agenda, in the specific quality of awareness present when nothing is being either reached for or pushed away. The Pali word amata, the deathless, is used throughout the canon as the Buddha's own synonym for Nibbana. He used it from the very beginning of his teaching life, when he first decided to share what he had understood after his enlightenment, and described what he had found as the door to the deathless, standing open for those willing to enter. The deathless is not a metaphysical location existing somewhere beyond ordinary experience. It is the quality of experience that remains when the dying process of clinging and craving is no longer running, when the mind is not in the process of constructing and defending and reaching and fearing, which is the mind in its ordinary conditioned mode. Most people have touched this, briefly, and without necessarily recognizing it for what it was. A moment of complete absorption in something beautiful, not appreciation of the beauty, not the thought, "this is beautiful," but the direct, unmediated experience of it, in which the gap between the one appreciating and the thing appreciated temporarily closed. A moment in nature when thought stopped without being suppressed, when the ordinary commentary of the mind fell silent of its own weight, and what remained was simply being present in a world that was completely here. A moment in the middle of genuine laughter, when the self-monitoring that ordinarily runs continuously was simply absent, not overcome, not set aside, just temporarily, not there, and in its absence, something lighter was present. These moments are not accidental glimpses of something unattainable. They are brief encounters with the quality the Buddha spent 45 years of teaching, trying to point his students toward, the quality that is always present underneath the reaching, always available beneath the noise of the mind's constant forward motion, never somewhere else, and never requiring any condition to be met before it can be recognized. In the Therigatha, the songs of the elder monks, parallel to the Therigatha used in the third teaching, the monk Mahakassapa describes his relationship to forest solitude in verses that carry the specific quality of someone who has found, in quietness, not the absence of life, but its most undisturbed presence. Mahakassapa was one of the Buddha's most senior disciples, known for his austere practice and his delight in simplicity. His verses do not describe a monk escaping from the difficulty of the world into the comfort of isolation. They describe a monk who has discovered, in the quality of stillness available in a forest, something that the noise of constant activity had been covering, not a different experience but the same experience, attended to with the depth that only quietness makes possible. He describes the quality of early morning in the forest, the sound of rain on leaves, the specific texture of a silence that is not empty but full of the aliveness of the world, attending to itself without any human agenda imposed upon it. What he is pointing at in these verses is not the forest as a location preferred over other locations. He is pointing at the quality of attention the forest conditions make available, an attention that is not reaching, not comparing, not building a narrative about what the experience means or how it reflects on the one having it. Simply present, simply here, in contact with what is actually here, which turns out to be considerably more than the reaching mind, always oriented elsewhere, had noticed. The forest Mahakassapa describes is available without traveling to a forest. This is the core of what the fifth teaching is pointing at, and it is worth being very precise about this because it is precisely where the teaching is most easily misunderstood. Inner silence is not the absence of sound. External quiet is the absence of sound, and it is genuinely pleasant, and there is nothing wrong with seeking it when it is available. But external quiet is dependent on circumstances. It requires conditions to align in a particular way, and conditions, as the second teaching made clear, do not stay aligned indefinitely. A quiet room becomes a noisy one. A peaceful life accumulates demands. A moment of external stillness ends. Inner silence is something categorically different. It is the cessation of mental proliferation, the quieting of papanka, the elaborate commentary. The mind runs on top of every experience, converting raw contact with the world into a thicket of associations, judgments, comparisons, and narratives. When this commentary is absent, even briefly, what remains is not nothing. What remains is the full, unelaborated, immediate texture of being present, the world as it actually is, rather than the world as the mind's running translation of it. This quality is available in the middle of a city at noon, with traffic noise and construction sounds and the full complexity of modern life pressing in from every direction. It is available because it does not depend on the external environment being a particular way. It depends only on the internal environment being, however briefly, free from the demand that everything be other than it is. The Buddha described this with great precision in the Udana, in a passage so compressed that its full weight can take years of sitting with it to unfold. There is, monks, an unborn, an unbecome, an unmade, an unconditioned. Were there not this unborn, unbecome, unmade, unconditioned, no escape would be discerned from what is born, become, made, conditioned. Sit with that for a moment. Everything you have ever experienced in the ordinary course of a conditioned life, every thought, every emotion, every sensation, every relationship, every circumstance arose from conditions, depends on conditions for its continuation, and will cease when those conditions change. It is born, become, made, conditioned. The suffering inherent in this is real. What is conditioned is impermanent, and what is impermanent cannot serve as permanent ground. But the Buddha's statement in the Udana does not stop there. It points at something that is not born, not become, not made, not conditioned, and it says that without this unconditioned reality, no escape from conditioned suffering would be possible. The escape is possible. This is the entire weight of the statement. The escape is possible because the unconditioned is real, is present, is available, not as a place to travel to, not as a state to manufacture through sufficient effort, but as the ground that has always been here, underneath and within and permeating every moment of conditioned experience, unaffected by the conditions arising and passing within it. This is what Kappa's Island actually is. Not a refuge from the flood built on higher ground that the flood has not yet reached. The ground itself, the unconditioned awareness that has never been in the flood, that cannot be swept away, that was present before the first wave of craving arose and will remain after the last wave has passed. How is this accessed in practical experience? This is the question that matters most for someone lying in the dark at the end of a long day, in a body that is tired, in a mind that has been running since early morning and is only now beginning to slow. The answer the Buddha gave, across many different teachings and in many different forms, is consistent. The deathless is not accessed through effort. It is accessed through the release of effort, through the specific movement of setting down what has been carried, of releasing the reaching, of allowing the forward lean of the seeking mind to rest back into the present moment that has been here the entire time the seeking was occurring. This is counterintuitive for minds trained in the logic of achievement. Every other valuable thing in a conditioned life has been obtained through effort, through working towards something, practicing something, accumulating something, becoming something more than what was present at the beginning of the effort. The deathless is the single exception to this logic, and the exception is complete. It cannot be obtained through effort because it is not absent. Effort aimed at obtaining what is already present simply reinforces the assumption that it is absent, which reinforces the seeking, which reinforces the tension of the reaching mind, which covers more thoroughly what was never not here. The practice is release, not acquisition. And release, unlike acquisition, can happen in any moment, in any condition, without any preparation or prior achievement required. Notice, right now, whether there is any residual effort in the body. Not obvious effort, the subtle kind, the background tension of a person who has been managing and maintaining and processing for an entire day and has not yet fully given themselves permission to stop. It lives in small places, a slight tightening around the eyes, a holding in the jaw, a quality of readiness in the shoulders that has not yet received the message that readiness is no longer required tonight. You do not need to relax this deliberately. Deliberate relaxation is still effort, still the mind managing the body's experience, still the activity of a self that is doing something to arrive somewhere. Simply notice the tension, wherever it lives, without moving immediately to change it. The noticing itself, without the addition of effort, often allows something to soften that could not be made to soften through trying. This is the practical texture of what the Buddha was pointing at when he described the island as possessing nothing, clinging to nothing. Possessing nothing does not mean owning nothing or caring about nothing. It means not adding the weight of a possessing mind, the mind that treats its experiences, relationships, and self-concepts as property to be protected and maintained, to what is simply, naturally, already present. Clinging to nothing does not mean feeling nothing or investing in nothing. It means releasing the specific grip that converts ordinary caring into anxious grasping, that converts appreciation into demand, that converts the present moment into a resource to be extracted rather than an experience to be inhabited. When the possessing and the clinging are absent, even for a single breath, what remains is the island. The quality the flood cannot reach, not because the flood has been stopped, but because the island is not in the flood's territory. It is the unconditioned ground that the conditioned flood moves across without ever touching. Kappa came to the Buddha with a question shaped by years of learning and preparation, carrying the accumulated weight of everything his tradition had given him to think with. The Buddha's answer was so compressed, so complete, that its full meaning could not be extracted from the words alone. Possessing nothing, clinging to nothing. 7 words in translation. A lifetime of practice pointing at something that, once seen, turns out to have been visible all along. The Sutta Nipata, from which Kappa's question comes, is widely regarded as one of the oldest layers of the Pali Canon. It has a quality of directness that the later, more elaborated teachings sometimes smooth over, a willingness to point at the destination without the full architecture of stages and practices and attainments that later systematization added. The Buddha of the Sutta Nipata speaks, often in a register of bare pointing, this is it, here, now, in the quality of a mind that has stopped its unnecessary motion. The Atthakavagga, the oldest section within the Sutta Nipata, returns again and again to a single Pali word as its description of what is being pointed at, santi. Peace. Not as an emotional state achieved under favorable conditions, but as the natural quality of a mind that has released its compulsive engagement with the proliferating activity of wanting and fearing and becoming. The Buddha uses santi and nibbana and amitta, peace and extinguishing and the deathless, interchangeably in the Sutta Nipata, pointing at the same reality from different angles, the way you might point at a single mountain from 3 different positions on the road leading toward it. What is it like, in ordinary lived experience, to touch this quality? The texts are careful not to over-describe it, because any description adds conceptual content to something whose defining characteristic is the absence of unnecessary conceptual elaboration. But there are qualities that practitioners across traditions and centuries have consistently reported, and they are worth naming plainly. There is a sense of sufficiency. The Pali word santuti, contentment, or more precisely, the quality of being satisfied with what is present, describes this. Not the contentment of having obtained everything wanted, but the contentment of a mind that has temporarily released the wanting structure itself and discovered, in that release, that what is present without the wanting is already complete, already enough, already whole in a way that the wanting mind, always oriented toward what is not yet here, could not see from within its own orientation. There is a quality the Pali texts describe as piti, sometimes translated as rapture, which is slightly too strong, or as joy, which is slightly too light. It is the specific quality of aliveness that is present when the mind is not generating suffering through its unnecessary motion, a quality that is not manufactured or achieved, but simply reveals itself when the manufacturing and achieving temporarily cease. It has been compared to the sensation of setting down a heavy load after a long carrying, not the presence of something new, but the release of something that was costing more than was recognized while the carrying was ongoing. And there is stillness, not the stillness of absence, not the flatness of a mind that has suppressed its responses to experience, but the stillness of a lake whose surface is undisturbed, which does not reflect any less clearly for being still, but reflects more clearly because the movement that created distortion has ceased. The Buddha used this image in several contexts. A mind in samadhi, in collected stillness, does not perceive less of the world than a scattered mind. It perceives it more accurately because the distortions introduced by craving and aversion and the commentary of Papanka are temporarily absent. This quality does not require a formal meditation session to touch. It does not require a retreat or a teacher or a particular tradition or any prior spiritual achievement. It requires only the momentary willingness to release the reaching, to allow this moment, with everything it currently contains, to be sufficient for this moment, without the addition of the mind's insistence that things be other than they are before the moment can be fully inhabited. Right now, in this body, on this evening, at the end of this particular day of this particular life, something is present that has been present throughout every moment of every day you have ever lived. It was present in the difficult chapters and the easier ones, in the moments of genuine clarity and the moments of deepest confusion, in the times when the story about yourself felt most accurate and the times when it felt most foreign. It was not more present in the good moments and less present in the bad ones. It was equally, continuously, quietly present in all of them, underneath the story, underneath the reaching, underneath the elaborate activity of a conditioned mind doing what conditioned minds do. This is what the Buddha was pointing at in the Udana when he described the unborn, the unbecome, the unmade, the unconditioned. Not a philosophical category at a safe distance from experience, but the living quality of awareness itself, the knowing that has been present in every moment of every experience you have ever had, the witnessing that does not arise when conditions are favorable and cease when they are not, the ground that the flood of conditioned experience moves across without touching. The island has always been here. Kappa traveled to find it and arrived at a teacher who told him it was the condition of not traveling, the specific quality of a mind that has released the compulsion to be somewhere other than where it already is. The flood is real. Old age is real. Sickness and death and grief are real as they were when Kappa named them in his question, as real as they are tonight in the life you are living. The Buddha did not answer Kappa's question by dismissing the flood's reality. He answered it by pointing at something the flood has never reached and cannot reach, not because it is protected from the flood by some external shelter, but because it is of a different nature than anything the flood can touch. The deathless cannot be swept away because it was never born into the current. It has no edges for the current to catch, no weight for the current to carry, no fixed position for the current to dislodge. It is the awareness in which the current moves, and awareness is not subject to what moves within it. Feel, right now, the quality of awareness itself, not its contents, not the thoughts and sensations and sounds and feelings that are currently present within it, but the simple fact of awareness, the knowing that all of this is being known. This knowing did not begin when the sounds in this recording began. It was present before and will continue after, in whatever form the continuity of this particular process takes forward from this particular evening. It is not manufactured by the content of experience. It is the space in which the content of experience arises and passes. Mahakassapa, in his forest at dawn, was not experiencing something categorically different from what is available to you right now in whatever room or space you are resting in tonight. He had cultivated, through long practice, the capacity to rest in this quality continuously, to return to it easily, to recognize it clearly, to release the reaching quickly when it arose, and find the island immediately beneath where he had been standing. The practice develops access and familiarity, not the quality itself. The quality is already here, in the awareness reading these words, in the body breathing, in the dark, in the knowing that is present in this moment without requiring any further effort before it can be recognized as what it already is. Possessing nothing, clinging to nothing. Not as an achievement to be added to the spiritual resume, not as a state to be maintained through vigilance, not as a destination to be reached after sufficient work has been done, but as the natural quality of a mind that has, for this breath, for this moment, released the unnecessary motion of the reaching and discovered that what was being searched for was here all along, patient in the way that only something which has nowhere else to be can be patient, present in the way that only something which has never been absent can be present. The island is this, not somewhere to travel to, not something to become worthy of. The quality of awareness, right now, in which everything else is arising and passing, the unconditioned ground that has always been here, that has never been anywhere else, that requires nothing from you except the momentary willingness to stop looking for it somewhere other than where you have always, already, been standing. Rest here now. Not as a technique, not as the next thing to do correctly, not as a performance of having understood the fifth teaching and arrived at its conclusion, simply as the natural movement of a tired body and a quieting mind at the end of a long evening, releasing into what has always been present, coming to rest in the deathless that was never somewhere else, settling into the island that was never anywhere other than here, exactly here, in this breath, in this body, in this awareness that has been present through every moment of every teaching tonight and will remain when the last word has passed into the silence that it came from and that it has, in truth, never left. Somewhere in the world right now, someone is sitting quietly, not meditating in any formal sense, not trying to achieve anything, not monitoring whether what they are doing is being done correctly. Simply sitting in a room that is theirs, at the end of a day that is over, with no particular story running about who they are or what they have not yet managed to become. Their hands are still. Their breath is moving on its own. The window beside them holds whatever the night outside currently looks like, and they are not narrating it to themselves. They are simply letting it be there, the way the night has always been willing to simply be there, requiring nothing from the person watching it. This is what the 5 teachings have been practicing with you tonight. Not information to carry forward and apply correctly. A quality of attention, the specific quality present in that person sitting by the window, not searching, not performing, not reaching for anything the current moment is not already offering. That quality is available to you right now, in this body, in whatever space is holding you tonight. It does not require the teachings to have landed perfectly or completely. It does not require you to feel any particular way about what you heard. It requires only what you are already doing, being here, breathing, present in the simple and sufficient fact of being alive in this moment. Rest now. That is enough for tonight.